watching in the battle, yeah. Say what you want about me, yeah, but I'm a living in the green world, and I need the air to breathe. Some will say you gotta get your kicks by removing love from a natural trip. But metal will rust and money will burn, yeah. And on the final page I ask, were you living in the green world? And did you give some in return?
So the red line here is the Palomar pipeline. It's the proposed route for the Palomar pipeline. And the Palomar pipeline connects to a proposed LNG, liquefied natural gas terminal, near Astoria in the Columbia River. And we'll talk some more about what that is when we get into the forest. But for right now, our focus is the Palomar pipeline, which is proposed to cross through 47 miles of Mount Hood National Forest. So this green area is the outline, is the border with the boundary of Mount Hood National Forest and private land. These are the wilderness areas, which have recently been added onto with new wilderness legislation, which was really exciting. So like this whole area is now wilderness. This is wilderness, this is wilderness, wilderness over here. So it's really exciting. Wilderness is one of the strongest designations for land designations for environmental protection. And it basically says these places are so special that we have to protect them. And one of the things that was included in that wilderness legislation, this was 2 weeks ago that passed, is additional wild and scenic river status, which is another environmental land designation that protects the corridor along a wild river, so an undammed river. The Clackamas River has had wild and scenic protection since the 80s, I think. And we are going to be walking along the wild and scenic river corridor of the Clackamas. What's really exciting is that in the wilderness bill that passed 2 weeks ago, this Fish Creek, which I pointed out in our car, also got wild and scenic river status. And so even though the Palomar pipeline is proposed to cross there, it will also have that special designation. The Palomar pipeline also crosses the Deschutes, which is out of the national forest, and that also has wild and scenic protection. The law has not been challenged. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act has not been challenged by a pipeline much. We actually haven't found any challenges by a pipeline. There is very strong language in Wild and Scenic Rivers Act about transmission lines. Unfortunately, pipelines was left out of the section that talks specifically about the fact that you cannot have transmission lines crossing a wild and scenic river. So they are trying to, Palomar, the company, which we'll talk some more about that company, Palomar is trying to get those laws amended for this corridor. And that would have huge impacts for many, many years to be able to change those laws. There's also numerous other laws that they're trying to get changed in order to make this an easier path for them and not be leaving themselves vulnerable to lawsuits and legal action from groups like BARC. And so those also would have huge impacts. And that's the reason that, as you were talking about earlier, Senator Ron Wyden wrote a letter saying these amendments are too far-reaching. You can't just change the law for a pipeline company, especially when it comes to such strong environmental designations like Wild and Scenic. And so we'll talk some more about that as we walk, but that's kind of a quick glimpse as to what we're seeing. So what we're going to be doing, this is the Rainbow Campground, which has been closed for a while because there's a lot of trees down, and I think they just haven't had the funding to come in and clean it up. So for the first couple hundred feet we are going to have to be walking over some trees, but then it's cleared after that, and it's a really wonderful trail that goes along the Clackamas. It's called the Clackamas River Side Trail, I think is the name of the trail. And it actually has national designation standards, or listing. So it's actually I'm not exactly sure what that means, other than it's like the Pacific Crest Trail has this status within the National Trail Registry that says it's special and should be considered high priority for the area in terms of keeping it cleared and accessible for people to use. And so Clackamas Riverside Trail is also, and the Palomar Pipeline crosses this trail as well. I am by no means an expert. I'm one of the BARC poster child examples. I started working at BARC as a volunteer, knowing very little about forest policy or forest ecology or Mount Hood even much at all, and just totally fell in love with the area and with the organization, and kept educating myself to the point where I came on staff, and now I'm the program director. But I still have so much I don't know, and so if you catch me saying something that you question or you want to add to, please don't hesitate. This is the Oak Grove Fork of the Clackamas. It begins up at Timothy Lake, which is actually a reservoir lake, and the Oak Grove comes along here. So the pipeline follows along the drainages into the Oak Grove for a significant portion of it, and then we'll come to the confluence into the Clackamas in a little bit, and then we'll be walking along the main stem of the Clackamas River. So it's a pretty significant tributary to the Clackamas, as you can see, and it's not even that much smaller than the Clackamas itself. But the permanent clear-cut corridor that they would need for the pipeline is 50 feet.
Oh, like 50 feet wide.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, exactly. And then the construction zone is up to 300 feet. Mm-hmm. So they would clear cut at first 300 feet, and then they would keep 50 of it cleared.
From my eyes, it's time for us to choose.
confluence of the Oak Grove Fork into the main stem of the Clackamas, which is, I think that's such an exciting thing to watch two rivers come together. It's really beautiful. You don't have a great view of it here, but you can appreciate the amount of water that's in this one spot. And I also think that this grove is really gorgeous too. So I was just gonna do a couple-minute introduction of what LNG is if people aren't totally familiar about liquefied natural gas. But about 5 years ago, I guess 4 or 5 years ago, there was an introduction to this proposal for liquefied natural gas terminals to be built on the coast of Oregon. And there were several proposed, and at this point there's pretty much 3 that still exist as proposals, 2 of which are on the Columbia. And they would be served by hundreds of miles of built pipeline that would connect to existing pipeline in eastern Oregon that goes down to California. And we can kind of get into some of the conflicts when we stop down, and this isn't always a great place to stop and talk because the river is sort of loud, but I just wanted to keep people thinking about why we're out here. And so liquefied natural gas is basically imported fossil fuel. It's gas that comes across the ocean, so it's coming from Indonesia is the biggest producer of it right now. Russia is trying to get into the market. They have a big project going on in the Sakhalin Islands that's having all sorts of environmental destruction issues coming up. And then Iran is trying to get into the market. So it's coming from, what happens is that the natural gas goes into a similar terminal there on that side of the Pacific where they liquefy it, put it in a ship so it's easier to transport in liquid form, and then it comes over to the US and they need a terminal here where they then gasify it in this really very risky production that has been called one of the biggest terrorist sort of targets in the US, which is why California has actually stopped all the proposals that have come onto the California coastline, is because they're afraid of the security risks. And so the kind of hunch by activists like me is that, well, why is it even in Oregon? Why is this proposal even coming here? Well, California banned it, but they still have a market down there, and so they kept thinking, well, Oregon won't. There's some people, I guess, that live there. I don't know. They're not going to even notice it. But what they didn't realize is actually there's a long history of resistance to that type of development in Oregon, and for the last 3 years, there's been this building momentum of activism around stopping these proposals from coming into Oregon, and it's been a really exciting thing. BART got involved in the campaign about 2 years ago when it became clear how much of the Palomar pipeline would be going through Mount Hood and what the impacts could be based on where it was proposed to go through. One thing that comes up pretty quickly is people ask, well, where do we get our gas from right now? And there's a pipeline that goes along the Columbia. It's on the Washington side of the Columbia, and most of it is coming from that gas pipeline that's in the eastern Oregon, and then there's one that comes down through Washington. So it's from Canada, and the Rockies is where most of the North American gas is coming from at the moment. There's some other proposed pipelines that would increase our supply from Colorado. So a lot of LNG activists are saying, it's not that we necessarily want to be continuing our dependence on fossil fuels, but if we do need more in this area, we could just be getting more from Colorado. Why do we need to go through this this international import to be able to get our gas supply? And not to mention the LNG gas import that they're proposing has this huge carbon footprint because of the ships that have the transportation that it takes to get it here. Once it's in the pipeline, it's in gas form. It's not.
It's taking it from that really cold state.
Yeah.
The gas stations.
Yeah.
What would happen?
And they would be using gas to do that, and so that's another part of the process of getting it to consumers, that the carbon release is actually really
First
big.
you can freeze it, then you have to
Right. And so a lot of people are sort of saying, well, we don't need this supply, so, and even the Oregon Department of Energy has said we don't need this supply, so why is it coming here, and why is Oregon being asked to take on this risk when California's already said that they're not willing to? So those are some of the conversations that are coming up. That's usually a first question, is where do we get it from, and that's the easy answer. One of the things that the gas companies keep saying is, well, we need more pipelines in case one goes out in order to maintain reliability. And I've started to really notice that when a gas company starts talking about reliability for its customers, that's when you have to start asking some questions, because often that reliability is sort of this, it's a proposal that is often being proposed in controversial terms, but being presented as a fear thing. Like, what happens if that pipeline goes out? Then what are you going to do? Do you remember how cold it was last winter? What will you do if something happens? And then people are kind of like, oh, that's a good point. Like, what if that happened? And I think that, you know, I guess I feel like we've been living for the last 8 years under this major fear-mongering, and that whenever a gas company starts talking like that, it just feels like their consumers are so vulnerable to that right now that they're taking advantage of it. And that's usually when I'm like, I wonder if this is really a necessary development, or if they're just trying to make money somehow. And I don't know.
Do you then, in your mind, connect that concept of reliability also to the proposed tanks they want to build for new reservoirs right in Portland for the Bull Run Reservoir as well?
Oh, that's interesting.
Do you connect that as like a similar idea in your mind?
I don't know. That's a
they're
really
talking
good
about
question.
that as a reliability thing, as well as well, we're not sure if we're going to be able to get the legislative, amendment that we need to retain our open reservoirs, and so we're building these as a security thing. So in case we have to shut off those reservoirs, we still have water for everybody in Portland.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting issue. Yeah, it's a slightly different issue, although it's interesting that you bring that up because there are similarities. I think that I guess that what I'm saying is that the gas companies are using it as part of their advertising, to convince people of a really controversial thing. And the Bull Run, the water issue, is a really controversial thing as well.
It's huge,
but it's a public resource. It's not something that somebody's making money off of. It's a nonprofit endeavor, and so nobody's trying to advertise to consumers that this is going to be okay. They're trying to convince taxpayers about, and I think that there's similarities, but I don't think it's nearly as egregious as millions of dollars is going into advertising for these gas pipelines, and that's one of the big advertising pushes that they're making is this reliability thing. And I'm kind of like, you should, I don't know, but you're right. It's interesting to think about that. I think the security risks in general, it's important to make sure that they're not using people's fear to get them to act on something that's maybe not necessary. But I also know that there are, continual. Well, it's interesting. We work some with the city of Portland on Bull Run issues, and it's really interesting to learn about some of the city politics that go into that, because a lot of the people who work in Bull Run are just like, we don't need to be stressing out about this so much, everything's going to be good as long as we take care of it, and here's what we need to do. And I think that what you have is a lot of interagency conversations happening around water issues, and that just inevitably makes things less clear and difficult. But maybe we could talk. I'll have to think about that. That's a good point. 90s, mid 90s, there was an effort by environmentalists to make a regional directive in this area that would encapsulate the special needs of these temperate rainforests that are so special to the Pacific Northwest. And it endured, the early 90s, it endured lots of political wrangling and eventually came out in 1994 as the Northwest Forest Plan. And the Northwest Forest Plan was based on the idea that we needed to create more habitat for species like the spotted owl, and that's where the spotted owl wars are sort of come out of that political time. And a lot of people know about the Northwest Forest Plan as it refers to spotted owls and those controversies, but not a lot of people really understand what the Northwest Forest Plan did for the forests. And essentially it had a two-part, I think of it as a two-part directive. One had to do with the aquatics in the Northwest, and so they created this thing called riparian reserves, and so around every body of water there became this new directive of how you log around a riparian reserve, which definitely meant no more clear cutting, but it included things like, well, if there are ways to thin that will increase the health of the water that's in that water body, then, well, yeah, I mean, I think that when you have, if you have invasives that come in, removing those invasives, that can be, so it's not even just logging like traditional taking down the trees, but also going in and then whereas they, did really poor replanting in when they logged before, there's also opportunities to come in and take some of the trees out in order to make room for other trees to grow up. It is, we believe, BARC believes it's virtually impossible to do this with a commercial priority also involved. You can't do restoration thinning, particularly in a riparian area, and make money off of it. But yeah, there are restoration things that you can do that will help the habitat recover from something. And then the other part that I always think of is the old growth forest. So they identified areas that had potential to be future old growth habitat for those types of species that are dependent on old growth forests. And those became the late successional reserves, or LSR. So if you hear people talk about LSRs, they're talking about forests like this, mature forests that have the very good potential to become the next great old growth forests. And there are huge swaths of late successional reserves in Mount Hood, many of which just got turned into wilderness. And late successional reserves has also this very strong directive that says you can only log where it benefits the forest. And that becomes, as you're picking up, really controversial because, again, you can't do that type of beneficial logging and still make money off of it, although they try to kind of do both at the same time. Yeah. So there's been logging in LSRs in Mount Hood since that happened. However, you'll never see a clear cut in a late successional reserve, and really you'll never see an aggressive logging project in a late successional reserve. And in that way, the Northwest Forest Plan, as controversial as it was, really was this sort of benchmark of trust between concerned citizens, environmentalists, and then the Forest Service, the agencies that are taking care of our public lands, which the intention of the public land is to benefit as many as possible, not the few that often are benefiting from the logging. So when we learned that the Palomar pipeline was going to be going through these late successional reserves, people got really wait a minute, what? You're going to clear cut in an LSR? No, you can't do that. And they're going to cross through several riparian reserves. I think on Mount Hood, actually I lost track on the last route that I was looking at how many there was, but there are quite a few riparian reserves that it's going through as well. And what we learned, like I was mentioning before with the Wild and Scenic stuff, earlier when we were at the cars, Palomar is trying to get the Forest Service to rewrite those rules where the route will go. So it wouldn't be that then suddenly they could clear cut this, but it will basically allow them for this one little area to be able to override those rules. And again, it brings up this question of like, you and I can't come in and do that without a huge fight. Like, how is this gas company able to just come in a matter of a few years, change environmental laws that took decades to get to, and now stand as like one of those really important benchmarks where it's like, we have trust and we have this understanding that, okay, maybe they're going to log a little bit in here, but they're going to do it as much as they can to the benefit of the forest, not, liquidate it. And so that's, I think that there's a lot of good reasons against this pipeline and this development. But to me, that's one of those really compelling reasons that I don't get to explain very often, because I don't have the time to sit here and just explain like the succession of events that have happened. But it's something that BARC has been working really hard to tell people about and take the time to get people out here and explain like what it is they're actually proposing to do, because it could have some pretty far-reaching implications.
To what degree do you think that they're able to sell this to the public because they can package it as green or bridge fuel or semi-green?
Or reliability.
Right. Do you think that plays a lot into it, why they're able to put these things on the board?
Well, that may be part of it, but I think that there's also they have some political connections that we'll never have. Northwest Natural has some very powerful people on their board, and Palomar is a subsidiary of Northwest Natural and TransCanada, who owns that existing pipeline in eastern Oregon. There's some very powerful people that sit on the board of Northwest Natural, the wife of Congressman Blumenauer. So whereas Blumenauer just did an amazing thing getting us all this wilderness and got that Wild and Scenic Fish Creek, his wife sits on the board of a pipeline that is currently threatening it. Now,
maybe he's sleeping on the couch now.
Their house politics are like, yeah.
But regardless, I think that Congressman Blumenauer has done a lot of really good things for Mount Hood, but that's a perfect example of.
Will you explain a little bit of the need for fallen trees, need for lying trees in the old growth?
Yeah, that's a good question, because or point to bring up too, because when they clear cut for this corridor, they'll be taking everything. They won't just be logging and leaving the snags, the standing dead trees, and the fallen trees, which provide such important habitat within the ecosystem. So yeah, it'll be a true clear cut. They will take everything away.
Salmon need gravel beds that are free of debris and silt to lay eggs, to be able to breathe, so that the eggs can get oxygen. And the level of silt that would run off from a clear cut without any overgrowth at all is unthinkable. It would prevent the salmon eggs from breathing any oxygen by depleting the oxygen in the water.
Mm-hmm. And it would keep running off, right?
Yeah.
It's not
year
like it would
after
just
year,
happen the year that they did.
They won't allow the trees to regrow in that area.
Yeah, that's actually, I forget about that part of it too, because also by removing the standing dead trees, that's really essential bird habitat. There's a lot of bugs that will come into those standing dead trees, and then the birds will come in and eat the bugs, and they'll make cavities where they can have nests. And then once the tree gets weak enough, it falls down and becomes like what we're sitting on, a nurse log. And besides the fact that this is great for the soil and the nutrients, it holds up a slope. It maintains the slope, but it also provides wet areas for salamanders and certain species like that to have habitat. So there's what Grady, who's one of our great hike leaders, always says on his hikes, and I've tried to remember to say them on mine, is that a lot of trees like the ones that we find here take as long to grow as they do to die, long to live as they do to die. I just think that's a really interesting thing, to think about. That the use of that tree continues on after it dies.
As far as the clear cuts alongside, the various tributaries go, if they're maintaining those clear cuts, are they going to be maintaining them mechanically or chemically as well? Chemically. And so that's going to be disastrous, not just for the salmon, but as well as for water quality for anybody who happens to be in a reservoir, downstream of these rivers, and that's just like a health concern, not just ecosystem-wise, but human as well.
The Clackamas provides the drinking water for about 180,000 people
Yeah.
through Estacada and Oregon City.
And if they didn't use those herbicides, I mean, the result would be a total infestation of non-native plants. So the trade-off is not necessarily better even.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say the herbicides probably have more impacts almost, but especially with water quality to drinking water. But you know, yeah.
But effectively, you can't just do a clear-cut corridor and wall it off from the rest of the forest and not have an effect.
Right. Yeah. And it creates this whole new. We had this intern last year do a piece that I included in with my comments to the Forest Service about the effects of having all this new edge habitat, which is like where they cut up to, it's going to be like this very severe forest and then no forest. And there's some animals that thrive on some of those edge areas, like elk, like that type of environment where it occurs naturally, like a prairie or something. But there's a lot of animals that are then left vulnerable because you'll have the prey be able to, the prey will be kind of able to be seen from the corridor, and it makes it so that things get all imbalanced that way. And I thought that was really interesting to learn some about that effect.
By the waterfall, so wonderful. As the water flows over me, I'm so thankful every day. I won't let it slip away. It's the little things we need to hear and say. Ooh.
A lot of people have been asking, like we've been talking a lot about energy issues on Mount Hood and on National Forest System, and one of the things I've been sort of going back to is in 2005 there was the 2005 Energy Policy Act that was passed, and it basically did some consolidation of agencies in order to fast track some energy issues or energy projects that would. The good side of it was to make renewable energies come online faster. The bad side of it was that they included gas and tar sands and some of the other domestic energy stuff into that effort as well. And so while it would be good to see renewable energy supply happen sooner rather than later and not get bogged down in bureaucracy, unfortunately they had to allow the big energy companies to also get in on that. And so one of the things that also came out of that act was a mandate for the National Forest System and Bureau of Land Management to come up with a programmatic framework for how to deal with energy proposals on public lands. Because right now, they had no process for how to deal with it. Let's say PGE, which is our local electrical company, wants to come on to Mount Hood and get geothermal. Well, they didn't really have a process to actually make that happen. So part of the Energy Policy Act was come up with a process, come up with a way that they can actually think about this. And because it inevitably would lead to an action, they had to do an environmental impact statement, which is basically the review process under NEPA. And what came of that is this document that now allows 9,000 acres of Mount Hood to be considered preferred area for geothermal. And so that makes it a lot more attractive for geothermal or energy companies, electrical companies to come on and start looking into geothermal exploration. Which is kind of scary, but it's a renewable energy source that if it's supplying a nearby community or city like Portland, may not be like the worst option, right? I mean, it's not like there's hundreds of volcanoes all around. Like there's one volcano. So if we're going to do really do geothermal, like that might be a good location to do it right. I'm not necessarily advocating for that on behalf of Bark. I'm just putting it out there that it might be good. The one problem is, in order to get that power that you're capturing from geothermal to the consumer, what do you need to do? Build transmission lines, right. Well, they anticipated that under the Energy Policy Act, and they said not only are you going to have to look at the source stuff, but you need to start looking at what are some preferred routes for new energy corridors. So including pipelines, you're looking at transmission lines, and you're looking at any type of like high tension kind of, like what you imagine seeing sometimes on highways, like those high tension power line kind of things. Well, we got these maps that they started, so they did that. They did this huge west-wide planning of what are the future energy corridors that we are going to need. Unfortunately, the Energy Policy Act said do this in 3 years because we need this now. So where do you go get that information? If you're like looking at millions of acres of public land, imagining where is this going to be needed, who has that information? You don't have that information. I don't have that information. Who has that information? Pipeline companies, gas companies, electric companies. The companies have the money to actually, and the incentive to actually figure out where they're going to need those. So unfortunately, what came out of that is basically what the industries want. You know, it's like this is where the preferred pipelines and transmission corridors ought to go, and it came directly from a lot of those companies influencing the agencies to say that. One of those preferred designated pipeline corridors is right where we're sitting, the Palomar pipeline. And under that designation, they said, you know, as long as we're making this cut, it's actually a pretty good route. Why don't we make it accessible to all possible energy transmission needs, including a pipeline? So it now has, the Palomar pipeline now has the highest preferred designation for any type of corridor, which sounds kind of like, what are you talking about? Basically what it means is that it can be up to 3,500 feet wide if you were to put everything that anybody ever wanted into the Palomar pipeline. So if like, once they make this cut for the pipeline, then an energy company comes along and says, you know, we figured out a biomass plant over here in Malala. Is it cool if we just use that corridor to get the energy over to the east side? And we'll just have to widen it a little bit because we don't want it running over the pipeline. So we'll just take a couple hundred feet this way. And then somebody says, oh, well, we have a solar plant over there, so we could do some high tension lines going in the opposite direction into Portland, so why don't we just widen it this way? So potentially, this thing could be up to 3,500 feet of transmission lines and pipeline. And that's why those changes that they're proposing to this corridor for, like, you can clear cut in a late successional reserve, you can cross a Wild and Scenic River, have much more implication beyond just Palomar, and could potentially lead to an even bigger corridor down the road, which is really scary.
The foot in the door thing.
But once they get started, it's that much harder to stop them, and that's why it's so important that we have to stop it right now.
What other alternative corridors are there for that energy transmission from, I mean, if they were to put a geothermal plant somewhere, you know, on Mount Hood, because it is the volcano we have, what other corridors are there that would be available? I mean, like I don't want to see a 3,500, you know, foot swath cut through here. That's, you know, that's said, but I mean, where would we want to put it? We want to put it along 84?
What I do know is that there wasn't enough planning put into where we're going to put this stuff. And where, like, doing it simultaneously just, while I understand why it makes the incentive for the companies better, like, if we find some major geothermal potential, we want to know that we can build the whole thing and get the money and make it happen, not have to wait for the transmission line planning to happen later down the road. But at the same time, it's like, once we start, we can't go back. You know, I mean, it will be that much harder to go back. And I just think that the planning for that type of development can't just happen that fast, and it can't happen in a vacuum with just the industry telling us where it's going and where it's most convenient for them. Like, that's just not how it's going to work. And that's the process that basically happened. So my answer is I don't know, but I'm not sure that there is an appropriate route through Mount Hood, which brings up a whole other issue. I mean, Portland is west of the Cascades. We have a whole mountain range that is keeping us from any potential energy source on the east side of, you know, like the Colorado has gas. Like, we can't get that without crossing through a major mountain range ourselves. If we had solar panels in eastern Oregon, we still would have to have transmission lines, all these things. So we're kind of like stuck in this little area, and that's one of the things that I think is the gas companies are using to their advantage. They're saying, like, you guys are just in this pocket. Like, what are you going to do if you don't have us? Like, you need us. And I guess that we have one of the largest solar companies that just relocated to Portland. Like, maybe we could be doing solar in Portland. Like, why do we have to go that far out? And I don't have the answers. I'm not an energy expert. I don't do energy policy. But those questions are valid, and we should be able to ask them, especially about public lands. Like, why do we need this? Do we need this? Is it worth the risk? Now that you're standing here and seeing this, like, is this worth cutting down?
So I finally found, after all this time, there ain't no reason and there ain't no rhyme. Indecision is the biggest crime, but the saving grace is yours and mine. Wrong or right, that's the beauty of life. Wrong or right, that's the beauty of life. Wrong or right, that's the beauty of life. Yes, it is. Wrong or right, that's the beauty of life. Yes, it is. Wrong or right, that's the beauty of life.
The geothermal that's proposed, the areas that PG is actually looking at doing exploration, is pretty close to Highway 35. So it's possible that, like,
They could run out along 35.
they could expand Highway 35 a little bit and run it there. That brings up all sorts of environmental issues, but again, it's like, it's an existing corridor that could potentially be used. And I was like, well, okay, so maybe I can get on with that. But guess what? I went out and decided to go see for myself where exactly they were proposing. Has anybody been up to Tamanoas Falls?
No.
That's what they're proposing to do it? Ew!
Exactly. You're like, you look on a map and you're like, hey, that's really close to Highway 35. That's not too bad. You could do it.
That's why I did do Tamanoas.
But then it's like you walk along it and it's the most beautiful, diverse, like, rich area. I mean, it's so wonderful. And the thought of, like, there being a geothermal facility as you're going up to the falls is just not good. Well,
But if it meant the Palomar pipeline wasn't here,
Or that you could undam all the rivers.
or you could undam
as
the,
a
you know,
geothermal.
which brings up, of course, public utility companies as being really the only way that you could do that and have it be, I mean, other than, like, legislating it or passing laws, which is just like a
like pulling
bureaucratic
teeth.
nightmare. Yeah. The pipeline was proposed to go under the river, upriver, about, I'm really bad at estimating distances, but you can see where it had been proposed, where you're standing, where it's proposed now. But in order to build an underground pipeline, they would have had to dam it temporarily, dam the river, and that's illegal under Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So now they're going to do an aerial crossing, and they're going to house the pipeline, which is mostly underground, in a bridge, a pedestrian bridge. Now there's no trail over there, so I don't really know what the pedestrian bridge would be leading to. It's totally wild over there. It's gorgeous. When we camped on that side of the river, we saw a bear. I mean, it's just like, it's incredible over there. And the trees are like 3 times as big. It's beautiful. But there's no way to get there. There's no trails down to it or anything. But I don't really know where the bridge would go, but that's what they're going to make it so it remains scenic. You know, you don't lose the scenic quality. I think that's why, it's like what you were observing, like why it's up. I understand it that maybe it won't it'll come up over the river because there are kayakers that use this river.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So it's got to be high enough for them to be able to go under it, I guess. I mean, I haven't seen a picture of what they're talking about yet, but that will come out in June in the environmental impact statement. In '96, there was major flooding in this area, and there was all this sediment that came down from off of the slopes down into Fish Creek, which is a major tributary for the Clackamas. And the impacts were so great, particularly because there were so many logging roads that the stability of the slope was really compromised by all these logging roads. So these logging roads are like falling down in the creek. And BARC was part of a bunch of environmentalist groups putting pressure on the Forest Service to use emergency money to take out the logging roads that were putting Fish Creek at risk. And they ended up removing over 100 miles of road from the Fish Creek watershed. So right now, it's about 3.5 mile walk up Fish Creek to the place where the Palomar pipeline is proposed to cross, and you walk on this nice old roadbed that's been chewed up and is gone. You basically can barely even notice it, except that you walk on a flat surface the whole way, and it's kind of a pleasant walk that way. But it's regrowing on either side of the trail that they've left. But the Palomar is proposing to rebuild that road in order to construct the pipeline. So not only is there this additional width when they construct it, but they also are going to have to build roads that we've been getting millions of dollars allocated to the Forest Service to take out. They're having impacts to stream and stream quality and soil quality. So yeah, I mean, I think that the construction of it is like this whole other level of environmental impact beyond just the maintenance of it. So what we're going to try and do is have as many people commenting through the summer on that, different parts of it. Like if people want to take one part and just read it and really understand what they're talking about and just respond to that, that's fine. Or if you want to write a super duper long letter, that's fine too. But basically just trying to get as many people to voice concern about it and thoughtful concern, which is part of actually influencing the process, is it has to be pretty substantial and
not just putting their name on a signed email.
Yeah. Which is good. I mean, having thousands, if you can do it in the thousands, it will have an impact. Like we got 2,500 people to respond to the last comment period. Yeah. And I'm quite sure that had an impact on things. I mean, maybe they don't have to actually respond to all of them, but they had to actually acknowledge that they got that many people responding. So anyway, and then the decision, they have said that the construction will begin a year from this summer. They think that they'll have a decision and it will start being constructed this summer.
Who makes the final decision?
Well, that's the thing
There's permitting in Oregon, isn't there?
There's permitting that still will need to, they think that they're going to get it all. But yeah, it's totally unreasonable.
So reminder what they originally said they'd start construction in.
For the terminals, but Palomar has been on the same schedule for a while. They've thought that this would, they haven't really, but yeah, the terminals have been delayed a lot. Under the Energy Policy Act, there had to be one agency who was responsible for everything, if not making the permitting happen. And for this project, it's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Which
they're
is
not elected.
Who's ever known anything about that? But they're DC people. They don't really have local operatives. They have this one dude, Doug, who's at the meetings, but
So our comments would go to them in DC.
Yeah.
To the Doug.
Wasn't it possible that even if they stopped the facilities on the coast, that they could still build this Palomar pipeline?
Yeah, and they keep saying that they are going to anyway. But
what would the pipeline do if they don't have the terminals?
They keep, it's bi-directional, So they keep saying that we could bring in more gas, more domestic gas through this pipeline. But there have been now, I mean, they've stopped saying that because there's been so many documents that have come out basically linking LNG and this pipeline that I haven't heard them say that at a meeting in a long time. They were saying that like a year and a half ago. I haven't heard them say that in a while.
Okay.
There's been a lot. I mean, there's so many, like for instance, they're in a binding agreement. The LNG company and Palomar pipeline is in a binding agreement that all LNG gas that comes through Bradwood and Oregon LNG has to go through Palomar. Now, how did we learn that? The opposing company, Blue Bridge, who runs the pipeline that we actually get gas from now.
Ask about that because they're trying to expand the Blue Bridge pipeline, aren't they?
Right. So, but the company that owns the Blue Bridge pipeline wrote this letter that they put on the FERC website, just belly aching to no end. Like, this isn't fair. This is against like all trade laws. Like, you can't just have a binding agreement. If there's that much more gas coming in, we want in on it. Like, you're impacting our sales. Da, 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 da. Oh my God, it was like beautiful to watch. Like these major companies just start whining. But what they also did is because they wanted to hold them accountable, they released all this really sensitive like data that we could never get, right? It's all like data that the companies have to get. They released it to prove that how much this would have an impact on the existing market. So it's pretty awesome because you don't, usually that stuff's pretty confidential, but they're like so pissed off about it that they actually, I think that they maybe thought they could help us, in stopping their competitor if they released some of their own market data.
That's hilarious.
And I caught, and when nobody really caught it, it was like hidden in this like random document, and I opened it up and I was like, what's this? And I was like, oh wow, oh my God.
The enemy of my friend.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh dear.
But yeah, that's right. They are thinking if they have a long-term plan, if that pipeline is not enough, or it starts to have, it's pretty old, and so they're starting to think it might start to fall apart.
There is a disease, a wicked proportion, love of money and gold. Its cure will never be had. This is what I've been told. This is what I've been told. You know you'll never be sold. Peas they love and distract. Mine will never be gold. Thinking all that is sad. This is what I've been.
Along the pipeline where it crosses the private land, there's a lot of communities that have come out against the pipeline, like made resolutions. The city councils have actually passed resolutions in opposition to the pipeline. The city of Moala passed one, Woodburn passed one, Gaston, the town of Gaston passed one. And then, as I think you brought up, the Clackamas County voters actually brought a ballot measure to the polls where they said pipelines were not appropriate for county land because the pipeline is actually proposed to cross one of their parks, their designated parks. And so they took that to voters, and it won, or the no vote, like no pipelines through, won by, I think it was 67%, like it was pretty overwhelming against LNG. And it's hard to organize around a no vote too, so that's considering that people weren't voting for something also, which is really great. And so in some ways Clackamas County, the people of Clackamas County have said no against this thing as well. And so BARC has been working on trying to get the city of Portland to pass a resolution against LNG development in Oregon. A lot of the gas company rhetoric has to do with, well, Portland's growing and we need this for Portland's population growth. And I think it's really important for, even though it's not passing through the city of Portland or Multnomah County, I think it would send a really strong message to the gas companies that if the city of Portland passed a resolution against this type of development in Oregon. And we've met with Sam Adams, and he was very intrigued by the possibility of doing this before he went into lockdown, and
tailspin.
It's very difficult to get him on the phone anymore. And Amanda Fritz, who's on the city council, has shown a lot of interest for it. I went and presented to the city council a couple weeks ago and gave them all a draft of the resolution we want them to pass. And so what I was going to ask is if people would take time tonight, especially because it's raining and it's kind of hard to write in the rain, if you took time tonight, and I'll give you this handout, and go actually post a message to Sam Adams, which you can do through his website. He has a website, and then you can just send him a message, and they actually do receive those and respond to them. And the website is on these handouts. And just tell him, I went out and saw the pipeline today, and if you feel inclined, tell him what you saw, and then if you would encourage him to propose the resolution to the rest of the council, because it will be much stronger if the mayor actually brings the the resolution to the city council to vote on, as opposed to one of the other council. House Bill 2015, which is the LNG Public Protection Act, which is another avenue that anti-LNG activists have been trying to have an impact. We have a bill in the legislature right now to try to make it so that a needs assessment is part of the permitting process for LNG to come into Oregon, because right now it's not mandatory for them to actually prove that Oregon needs it before they build LNG development, and so this would make it so that the Oregon Department of Energy would have to say that there is a need for it before it was built. Now the catch of that is that Oregon Department of Energy already has said that there is no need. But it would also ensure that down the road, if we do kill LNG this time and it comes back, that they would have to then go through another needs assessment